I want to say thank you everyone for joining us. This is going to be a really exciting conversation. I've been looking forward to this for quite a while, and I really do appreciate you taking your time today to chat about design, right? And to chat about medical devices and where the industry is going. And I think there's a lot of small conversations happening, and we thought this would be a really great opportunity to bring the community together and say, okay, how do we have a bigger conversation about not only design thinking, but design in general, design inspiration, but also, if we had to rethink the way we do some things, and it seems like we may have to rethink them, is that an opportunity? And how do we make it an opportunity versus just something that we have to do? And I felt like this was a great time to link up with Jeanette, who's been doing some fantastic work at Loft and has just been kind of taking the world by storm. And honestly, I love kick-ass women. So I love kick-ass dudes too, but I love kick-ass women. And I love to highlight the work that people are doing in our community because I think it's so important. So I want to first introduce Jeanette from Loft. And Jeanette, I don't know if you want to give a little background on yourself and say hi to everybody.
Hey everybody, nice to see you again. I've been listening in on the MassMEDIC town halls and really energized by the community. Which is actually one of the big reasons why we did the pivot that we did, which I'll get into, but I do want to thank MassMEDIC for really energizing this community, and I think these forums are part of the answer for how to get through this unknown time. So that's my short intro. We'll kind of go from there. I know we have a little short time right now, and we'll get into it.
Sounds great. Okay, so to kind of set the stage, one of the things that Jeanette and I were talking about for a little while, and when we were talking about design thinking, was this word unprecedented. And I don't know about everybody else, but it's been so used lately, and it kind of made me cringe every time someone said unprecedented. And it kind of started me wondering, what actually is unprecedented? And I looked it up, and it's defined as having no previous example. So in my opinion, and this is a very limited worldview, nothing that what we are going through is unprecedented in this scenario. It might be different, it might be a little strange, and it might not have happened in our lifetimes, but there's always precedent for at least pieces of the current situation. And so it started me wondering, Jeanette, as a designer, when things are unprecedented and there's no clear example, where do you go for inspiration, and how do you make things make sense when things don't seem to fit?
Right. Well, actually, you've just described perfectly the role of a designer, which is to know where to go in the unknowns and to make something out of nothing. And that's really what we do every day. So this feels very familiar and somewhat comfortable these times. We sort of actually relish it because everything we've known in the past is kind of thrown out the window, and we can charge ahead with these kind of new rules and change, which is something I personally love, change. So I often get questions when we're designing something like, how could it be better? How could you make anything better? And that's really where we start. We never assume anything is perfect. So
yeah, I think that's a really good perspective. I think it's hard when it comes to medical devices, though. I mean, there are such strict regulatory concerns. There are such strict processes. How do you start to think outside of the box when I think in the med device community, especially, we draw such great boxes around things of the way things are?
So, over the years, that box has gotten really well defined, which has been great. And we have a set of guidelines. What I fear, though, is we start with the box too soon. And so my advice is always to live in sort of a sandbox mode before you enter into that tighter box. So as innovators in the space, I always recommend, don't go in the box until you've had enough time to kind of float around in the fuzzy outside until you're really ready, you know what you want to do, and then you can enter those regulatory processes that the FDA wants to see. Because too often, and I've been to many conferences where the first thing people want to start with is, what class device are you going do? Who's the payer? You know, those are the last things really we should be thinking about. If we're thinking about design thinking, which is, you know, an also overused term, but at its core, it means start with the user, start with the patient, and think about what they are going through, and maybe don't even think of them as a patient, but just a person who has an issue. We're not defining them by their issue or their disease. They're just trying to get through this thing that they're trying to get through. And that's the core of design thinking, is really starting with them first. Not the insurance company, not the payer, not the system, you know, on and on. So
it's just so in conflict with the way startups have to go about things, or even, you know, major medical device companies, right? If you've got, first of all, you've got to find somebody to pay for it. That's the first question, right? When we're talking to companies, we're talking to clients, we're talking about devices, who's going to pay for this?
And it hasn't always been that way. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So
it just seems like it's so completely opposite of what you should be doing to design a product that is going to make a big impact, not just financially.
yeah, and I think, as people have mentioned on the town halls here, that the FDA isn't going to go back to the way it was. Some of those guidelines are evolving as we speak, and so that's a really exciting time to just check ourselves. You know, we're certainly going to still make safe and effective devices, but let's take this opportunity to check the process to make sure we're doing what we set out to do.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I do want to get more into that later, but I also wanted to ask, as I was, you know, I'm not a designer by background. And so my immediate thought process when I try to find design inspiration is I'm going to Google it, right? I'm going to go to the internet. And it got me wondering, as I was scrolling through design sites and I'm scrolling through Reddit feeds and I'm surfing LinkedIn and all these other things. I'm on IDSA's website and trying to get inspiration. Where do you go for design inspiration? What's your kind of go-to?
Yeah, I mean, it does vary. We don't go to one channel. Google is certainly one. You know, there's lots to be found there. But really, the beginning is talking to people, really just having those one-on-ones, and start with a big qualitative discussion. But you know, that is where we go for our inspiration. And there's a term I have borrowed from a speaker I saw once called Liz Jackson, and she calls it design thanking. So instead of thinking of like, you know, I came up with this great intervention for these patients, really, you should be inspired by what they are telling you, and thanking them for that inspiration. So she coined the term design thinking, but I like to use it here as well.
It's interesting. I think there's a deeper conversation on that too. I'd love to chat about it, especially as we start to rethink the user. But okay, so for those, I'm assuming everyone on the phone has at least a little bit of the background knowledge on design thinking. But at a very high level, talk to me about what design thinking strategy is.
Yeah, super quick. It was actually a construct invented by a design agency, not unlike Loft, but by the name IDEO. And it was a way to define the design process so that businesses would understand that there was a process. So, you know, businesses like to live in logic and practicality and understanding sort of the A to B journey. So to communicate the value of design, IDEO created this idea called design thinking, which has a process, starts with the user, understand the user research, then define the problem, then on and on. And so it's this set number of steps that defines really the whole design process.
How often, so I've heard the term a lot, and I think everyone's kind of got a different perspective on what that actually is and what it means. How often do you think people are actually employing this as they are designing medical devices?
Well, everyone wants to say they use research, but it's my job to constantly remind them of what that research said along the way. So we'll often do a project where there's been a research phase and we've documented what did the users prioritize, what did they need, and along the way, that's the first thing people want to discredit or cut, because it's not hard logic. It's not like, well, it's going to weigh less, or it's not a stat that can be easily defined. So really, that user is informing the whole stage, and if you lose sight of that from the beginning, then all these other criteria are going to take precedent when it really has to be equal footing for everything.
Yeah, and I would imagine when budgets get cut, that's probably the first quickest way to say, oh, well, we already know this. I'm sure you can make some assumptions about the users, but I would imagine that could often cause design problems down the road.
Well, right. I mean, you never want to assume, I teach my younger staff here that you're not the user, and nor
Mhm.
should you ever think you are, because yes, you've been taught skills of how to uncover the needs, but that doesn't mean you're the expert. You're just the expert at uncovering the needs of someone else. So never assume that you are that it's for you, because that's when you get into those emotional conversations of kind of trying to fight over things. You know, I also heard a interesting way of thinking from some scientists at NASA, where they don't refer to their projects as mine, or they don't use any pronouns. They call it the project, or like the data instead of my data, because they would be in a meeting and they would say, well, my data says this and my data says that. And so they would have all this emotional weight that would just is unnecessary.
That's really interesting. I like the way you just, I like to think about that just from the perspective of it's not your story, right?
Right.
As we go to tell a product story, it's not necessarily your story, and it's not necessarily the way you would react to something. So you've really got to step outside of that. I think that's really, it's interesting, and I'm sure it is not easy to do. And is that why working, in teams can be helpful, right? You probably have all those different perspectives, but how do you balance that, right? Everyone's got a different opinion. How do you really go get that data? And I know I'm pushing a little off what we were talking about, but I'm just curious.
No, it's a great question. And I really think, actually, to bring it back into what's happening right now, is there's no room for ego. Like, this is a time for practicality, for getting things out there to really help people. It's not a time to be, pounding your chest and saying, I have the best solution. It's, there are going to be many solutions for today's problem, because there's so many different ways we can help.
Mm, yeah, that's really interesting. I want to come back to something that we were talking about before we got on the call about response versus reaction. And I mean, I feel like there's a whole webinar just about those two words. But I mean, I think my question for you is, you are a small business owner, you run an organization, and it's hitting a lot of businesses really hard. I think the normal reaction for most people was a small amount of panic and a small amount of uh what the heck is happening? What do I do? How long did it take you before you started thinking about what you could be doing instead of
Right.
staring at what was happening?
Yeah, I mean, everyone, I'm normally the level-headed person in the business, and everyone's running around screaming fire, and I'm trying to kind of like keep the calm. um, but for me, I started getting invited to these kinds of talks and makers chats about PPE in particular, and masks and things like that. And what I saw was a lot of reaction, like, we can do this, and I have some tools, and I can go make something. And that scared me to know that they're going to go put that on a person who is in, a dangerous situation. So I started to back away and say, this is very reactionary. I love the energy, but we still have to, check ourselves. And that's what made me think, as leaders, let's harness that energy of people who are kind of going for it and reacting. But as leaders, we need to be responsible to kind of filter and guide that energy. So bring in our expertise and help, say, I love what you're doing here. Let's kind of pivot and make sure we're checking it to be safe or whatever. And that's the response that I think is necessary.
I think that's really great. I think so many people, and I can be honest, my initial reaction was, oh, okay, this is kind of crazy. I feel like I have no control over anything. So what can I marginally have a small amount of control over, right? And I think for a lot of people that was panic buying. It was,
Mm-hmm.
I can buy this, I can do this. For others, it was, I have this tool, this is at my disposal, I can
Right.
use this. But I think you're absolutely right. As you start to look at the bigger picture and say, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this, there needs to be a step back and say, what should I do? Or what's a
Absolutely.
bigger picture? We can
Absolutely.
all do things, but how do we make it so that those things have the most impact and the biggest benefit? And I feel like that's probably something you deal with in a lot of your design projects as well. You could do a lot of things to design a product, but what's going to have the most impact?
Yeah. And I think that in the old days and we work with a lot of universities and scientists, and they are very excited about what can be done. We are there to say, what should be done with the context of the user or the application. So it's a great point.
Yeah, it's so hard to, I think, for many people to not have that control. I think it's hard for anyone to feel a lack of control. And so like you said, the impulse to do something is wonderful. I think it's that immediate reaction, and then it's okay, well, let's take a little bit of a step back. So I think that's a great opportunity to say, I'd love to walk through kind of what your response actually was to, and if you want to share your screen, I'd love for everybody to be able to see the slides that you have on the fantastic work. And I'd love to know how this project with the National Guard came about, right? Not that many people would reach out and start throwing ideas around of what they could do to help. So I really love it.
Yeah, so I'll keep talking. Looks like I am disabled attendee screen sharing. So
yep, see if you can do it one more time.
See if I can do it one more time. Cool, okay. All right, and let's go here. Okay, so these are images of a project in process, and you'll see some National Guard folks in the background here. And this is on site actually in the parking lot of the building I'm sitting in right now. So behind me, you can see the same conference room that now has been totally cleared out, and we made room for a rather large workshop. What happened here, what this project is a testing booth, an iteration on a testing booth, in which what happened was I reached out to the state of Rhode Island to suggest a design for some testing at some of the local clinics here in the city for the underserved population, where I saw clinicians, who run like a normal healthcare clinic, treating both normal patients and then also doing COVID testing at the same time, like through the same doorway. And I was like, ooh, good for them for reacting and saying, hey, we can provide testing in this community, but this was my responsibility now to say, I love what you're doing, but let me help you make it a little safer for both the staff and the patients coming in. So I sent that. I really just sent it, threw it over the wall to the state, and snowballed, happened basically a bunch of conversations. Later, the National Guard calls and they say, hey, we want to elevate this and implement it with something we've been thinking about, that are mobile testing sites that we can take to facilities on site with 2 mobile trailers and have both intake and testing at the same site for populations like nursing homes or first responders or places where they're not mobile. They're not able to drive to a testing site. They're not able to walk in some cases. And we said, great, let's work together. Has anyone ever worked with the National Guard here on the call? This was a learning curve for me too. And so, the Guard's main mantra was to keep the soldiers safe. So this was actually a great example of design and, business, I guess if you would call it that way, coming together, where they had a desire and we had sort of our side, which was keep the patient safe, make the workflow easy, make them know where to go and what to do. And the Guard was mostly interested in keeping the soldiers safe. So we worked kind of through a little tension there to figure everything out from both sides. But what we ended up with was, pretty successful solution that we built here on site. 4 total trailers, which have been testing for about 2 weeks. About 8,000 first responders are planned to go through these tests, and it's been a great success. In fact, I think even more patients are moving through these mobile sites than are moving through what they call hard sites, which are the drive-up testing sites.
I'd love to go back to maybe that moment for like a second. You've got the colonel there. This is the mission. This is what you're doing. Was it at all intimidating to kind of raise that hand and say, okay, great, but what about X?
We said it many times in the beginning, and I think you know, Rachel, you sent over some questions ahead, which I appreciate. And one of your questions was, "What would you do differently?" And that would be raise that hand sooner and more forcefully. But I have to hand it to the guard. You know, they're very respectful of the citizens. They know that that's who, in the end, pays their salary. So they know it's a two-way street, and there was no disrespect from either side, really. I just think they had a lot on their mind. They just wanted to get it done and get it out there and show sort of the numbers, and they weren't really they didn't really want to take a step back to slow anything down. So we just had to be mindful of that. But I would have inserted that sooner, because it did come back later. I was like, oh, you know what, your idea for XYZ was actually good, and we're going to go ahead and change it to make it that way. So
that's so interesting. I could absolutely see that conversation playing out so many different ways as you are designing medical devices, right? And there's all these pushes and pulls and all these stakeholders. And I think this is a really excellent point too, a really clear example of multiple users, right? There's the National Guard, who is one user of the product that you're putting together right now, but then there's also the patient who is the user. So how do you combine both of those users to make an experience that gets what they both need in a way that works? And I'm sure that's not the first time you've come across that issue.
Yeah, and the guard is actually they're not very interested in the user at all. They want to just move people through and get the job done, and they're traditionally not known. I mean, if you see soldiers show up in your neighborhood, you're like probably hiding in your house. You're not really excited to see them. So we really had to kind of like remind often, you know, you're intimidating. You show up in this trailer with your fatigues on, and like you've already set like a level of stress in this community that is scary. So.
Yeah, they're already there because of there's a heightened stress level, right? They wouldn't be there if there wasn't a crisis.
Yeah.
I know from my perspective, and I'm sure I'd love to know your opinion too. We oftentimes would like to maybe change our client, you know, just one thing maybe about them that isn't as understanding of the design process, without being too forthcoming. Is there anything you would have changed about the working with the guard?
I think, let's see, probably would have had tested the patient sooner. So we were only getting one side of sort of the story of what they wanted to do. And probably would have encouraged and had them invite in sort of, you know, even their staff or something to just think about, you know, you're not only kind of administering these tests, but you're dealing with a population. You're trying to kind of keep the ease there. So yeah, I guess the other thing with this particular client is like so diverse. We had the colonel who is, you know, in his 40s, and then you have the staff, like literally like teenagers, like 18. And so there was and the way they're trained is, you know, subordination, right? Like, yes, ma'am, yes, sir. Whatever you want me to do, I'm going to do it without question. And so that mentality I would want to change about them, of just like, please tell me what's wrong. Because they would say, no, it's fine. Like, oh, my arm's like, I can't feel my arm anymore, but I'm fine. Like, no, it's okay to tell me.
That's never fine. It's never fine.
No.
I don't know. That just seems like such a perfect example of innovation rapidly, right? And you have to be, it's like that idea of continuous creativity. You have to be continually shifting to adapt to to new constraints. And that seems incredibly applicable to the kind of work that the med device community does on a regular basis. I wish there were more med device designers on this. I'm gonna like shoot this to everyone I know and say, hey, this is how you actually have to do things.
You know, and I cringe at these pictures, to be honest, because I'm a designer, right? And we have a very high level of polish that we like to see on things that we put out in the world. But this is a moment, as I said, where egos go out the window and practicality is what you want to be chasing. And so I put this out there like a very vulnerable, raw state, because the reality of the constraints were getting the material in a short amount of time. You know, what did we have that we could work with that isn't our normal level of sort of, you know, design aesthetic. So please, no judgment on the quality here.
I know that plexiglass looks a little smeared.
It's a little smeared, yeah. I do have a video here if anybody wants to see it. I don't know how we're doing on time. But.
Oh, no, you're fine. Yeah, I'd love to see it.
Great. So let's see. Okay, these are just some stats, actually. So I'll come back to this, but let's get into the video. I think it explains kind of the whole system a little better. Can you hear the sound?
No.
Okay. Sound is coming through my headphones, but not playing for you.
I don't hear it. Does anyone else on the call hear the sound?
Okay. I haven't done this before, actually, with sound. Let me... Anybody have any tips for how to play sound from a video? The Google slide. Nope. Head shaking.
Oh, clicked optimize for audio on Zoom when you share screen.
Okay, let's stop share.
Share screen, there's an option that, like two little check boxes, one for optimized for video and one for optimized for audio.
Okay, so I share computer sound. That's what I see. I see one. Oh, okay, if I click that one, let's see what happens. Now it's asking me for a password because Google. What are you seeing?
It says double click to enter full screen mode. So we see black, we see screen sharing.
Sharing paused. Bring your shared window to the front. Yes, please.
Oh, Zoom.
I'm so sorry about this. Okay. Still see black?
Video is back.
Okay. Here we go. Okay, let's try this.
Hey everybody, I'm Jeanette Numbers, co-founder of Loft, and today I'm going to take you through our mobile testing sites for COVID-19.
When we first approached RI Commerce with this project, we weren't exactly sure what to expect. We had resources and space and we wanted to help, and it turns out that was all it took. They connected us with the National Guard and we began building a week later. The trailers work as mobile testing sites for COVID-19, and they're split into two parts. The first site handles intake, and the second handles the actual test. The goal for these sites is that they will save time, money, PPE, and lives. We designed the sites to keep soldiers protected while enabling testing for hundreds of people a day and saving thousands of dollars in PPE per week. It's an efficient, user-friendly, scalable system. Ultimately, this experience has taught us a lot about what we're capable of as a team and about reaching out to help when and where we can. The only way out is through, and we'll only get through it if we work together.
Yay. Can you still hear me? Good. Okay. So that kind of explains the system a little bit. And if you didn't catch it, there are two trailers. And this is designed for patients or people who don't have appointments. So if anyone's been tested, you know you have to get an appointment from your primary care, which is how the intake happens and all the documentation of, you know, your result getting to the right person. In this case, you can just walk up if you are homeless even or in a tribal land. You can walk up, get intake. The soldier will give you your test with a barcode on it. You'll walk that over to the testing trailer, get tested, and then drop your sample into a chamber where it will get mailed away or sent away, and then you'll get your lab results. So it's really designed for that most underserved population who doesn't have healthcare access typically. And here is a shot of the Woonsocket Police Department lined up. So in Rhode Island, if you haven't heard, testing is a big thing here. And this is the start of, I think think this was 2 days ago, of getting that 8,000 first responders in 2 weeks to kind of get through those ranks. And even in the first day, there was, the city of Cranston had 3 positives, and that resulted in, 30 other first responders going into quarantine, which, just as you know, exponentially saves other people from getting sick or getting hospitalized. So pretty powerful.
So we had a question come in from the group. Are other states going to be able to adopt these? Has there been any discussion about going bigger with this project?
Yeah, so we just released this video. We're trying to do our own kind of marketing. The state of Rhode Island, the National Guard of Rhode Island has talked to the National Guard of Massachusetts about the same system. And I believe Illinois was also interested as a first group. So the Guard is kind of doing their thing on their weekly calls with FEMA and places like that. This does not have to be run by the National Guard. It can be run by anyone. The Guard is just the people power, and they've been called to service through May. So just utilizing that people power. The cost to build one of these is relatively low in terms of saving. I don't know if you saw the stat on the PPE dollars, but the cost to build one of the trailers is about between $15,000 and $18,000 for 2 trailers. The cost of PPE in 1 hour for the system is $350. So you're basically paying for the trailer in a very short amount of time, just in the savings of that PPE, not to mention kind of the ease of intake. So, I would say, please reach out if anyone is interested. I can give you more information.
That's really awesome. It seems like something that could definitely go bigger. So I think that's fantastic. And honestly, that's a great shot, right? These people are putting themselves out there and putting themselves on the line to keep us all safe. I think that makes it all worthwhile right there. Yeah. That's fantastic. Yeah. So I did want to shift, and I'm hoping we still have about 10 minutes left, and I'd love to get audience feedback and, make it a bigger conversation. But I think as we start to rethink where we're going, right? And let's come back to that topic for the last 10 minutes, right? Is there an opportunity to take what we're learning and rethink the way medical devices are imagined and designed? There's obviously flaws in the process. There's obviously bottlenecks. There are things that are happening quicker that never happened before at that speed. So, is there an opportunity here for, a medical device renaissance?
Yeah, I love that term. Yeah, please chime in. I love it when more people talk in these things instead of just 2 people.
But what do you think? It seems like what you had to do in this opportunity was rethink the end user, right? And right. Rethink that process. It seems like that would be a really easy place for med device to start.
Right. So it's, something you and I have talked about in the past, which is giving these users more credit than we currently do, not treating them like basically idiots, where there's this, mentality of med device being very technical and very loaded with vocabulary that patients don't understand. Well, we need to rethink that and really come to them with a conversation that is more on their level and let them rise to the occasion. That's actually what we're seeing even in the design side is a lot of people have more skills and more knowledge than we give them credit for. It should not be sort of like handcuffing only a certain select few to be the creators and the developers. I think if you give people space to innovate on their own and advocate for themselves, then good things will happen.
I've definitely heard a lot of that lately, of meeting people where they are, but also giving them the opportunity to take more control. We preach, I think, in the medical device community that you need to be your own advocate. You need to do your research, but then we don't actually trust people to understand their own conditions and to take responsibility for their own care. So it seems like we're telling them to do something without giving them the authority and the power to do it as well. So that seems like something we need to try to shift as we move forward.
Completely agree. Yeah. I would think one of the easy things, and it's something we try to do with new projects, is the idea of vocabulary and using terminology that is more generalized and not so laden with acronyms and, jargon. I think that could help. That's one small way, but just to communicate in a shared common language.
Interesting. Joseph was chiming in, said, would the next step for your trailers be a negative pressure trailer?
Yes, actually, yes. So what you would see in the next slide is a single trailer with positive pressure, actually, where the clinicians are inside and patients are outside.
So cool. That'd be really interesting to look at. And Helen was asking, how do you think the current situation, this is a really good question, Helen, how will the current situation change or accelerate the time it takes to design, innovate, and build, right? You had to move so quickly on this and constantly be adjusting to new scenarios and new situations. There's obviously, it scares people to do that, right? There's risk, there's room for error. I mean, and right now we heard on our town hall, right, with the EUA and the relaxed regulatory guidelines, things that are happening, people are giving, liability. It's all kind of getting a free pass. It's not going to get a free pass forever. So how can we take the good things and accelerate our timelines?
Right. Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, risk is, especially when it comes to lives, is a very tricky subject. But I would say the best way to accelerate is to not constrain yourself so early into kind of having all that baggage so soon. We do best when we have an open sandbox in the beginning and try to keep that as open as possible, to just iterate. And, there's still risk there, but I think having a wider funnel in the beginning before you get down to kind of those tighter constraints. And what ends up taking the longest is the verification testing, and you don't need to do that for every concept. Get yourself to a point where you feel good about it, and then you can go through that more regulated verification process.
Really great question came in. Do you think there's an option to do this with low resource countries through the NGOs? I think this would be an excellent application.
The trailers, yes, are essentially just structures. They're really PPE saving structures to keep the clinicians who have to kind of deal with multiple patients over and over, keep them safe and keep the facility easy to navigate. So, I mean, that is one of our priorities is here in the US, tribal communities who don't have the federal funding, who don't have the National Guard, don't have healthcare typically, to put put it on the back of a pickup truck and haul it into wherever you need to go. The scale is, these trailers are 16 feet, and that accommodates 4 patients on the intake and 2 on the testing side, which gets us to that 60 person an hour ratio, but 16 feet can fit literally anywhere.
Do you foresee other changes in the way you approach design, during normal times?
So one thing I think we do here at Loft is we're a small company. We tend to have a little bit of kind of what is the new business coming in, and what is the sort of experts, what are they doing? We try not to filter into cross over too much, but I'll just give you a story of what happened in this case, which was, hey guys, who wants to, do you feel like you're up for this challenge? And I really offered it to the team to become more invested in the process. I didn't know where it would go. I didn't know if we would fail or succeed, to be honest. I said, please join me in this journey if you're interested. So I think, having that more cooperative space is where I see us personally going.
Okay. I like that. How many of your people were involved in the process?
Core stakeholders were 4 of us. So I think a few of them are on the line here, but it touched everyone in the company. So in some way, and some people weren't necessarily builders. This is where you got to go back to your strengths too.
Yeah, and I did want to make that point because I love the story with the Guard is so much about understanding your strengths and what you're good at, right? The Guard is good at what they do. but designers are also good at what they
Right.
do. And when you can put that multifaceted team together and say, great, let's take everything that we do well and try to make those things the best outcome possible. And I think that's so much a part of the ecosystem, and especially here in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and everywhere in New England, right? We have such a great community of med tech and medical companies who can come together and say, look, we all try to do what we do best, but what can we be doing together that's going to make the best outcome possible? And I think that's a really big, hopefully, moment that comes out of this. You've seen more companies working together, you see technologies merging, you see people pivoting. It doesn't just need to happen in a time of crisis. That should be something that we're all working towards together.
It's a community for sure. I think,
Yeah.
you know, we had success here somewhat because it's a small community, Rhode Island, small state. But I think it can scale very easily to be, you know, a very cohesive, collaborative community.
Yeah, it's a great story, and I'm so glad that we were able to have this. We are jumping right up on time, but I want to make sure there's no other questions from the audience before we pause for the evening. I think this has been a really great conversation and such a great story of what people can do when they come together. So Jeanette, thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Thank you. And I will give you guys kudos again for really the inspiration to know, you know, just to go for it, essentially. Like sitting on those town halls, it gets so much energy. And I think what you're doing is creating that community as well. So thank you.
Thank you, and we're so glad to have you all as members. So I guess this is a great time to say thank you to everyone. Really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us, and thank you for all the support. This has been fantastic, and I hope to see you all soon. Have a good one.
Bye, everyone.